Well, when I started doing this work, it began. Well, I've been involved in the Psych Survivor community in Toronto for since 1990. I was about to say 90 years.
It only feels like that,
Yes,
Geoff.
I meant 1990. Yeah, so I started being involved in the Psych Survivor community since 1990 in Toronto, but mind you, I did go to an event. Actually, it was a book launch for Shrink Resistant, but I didn't know people then about a year and a half earlier in '89. And Don and Bonnie and others were there, and Graham, but I didn't know them then. I didn't get to know them till later. But anyway, but of course my interest goes back to my being a patient in my teens and so on, outpatient and inpatient then. But I didn't tell anybody, so I came to Toronto, outside my immediate family, obviously they knew. But I came to Toronto to do my degrees, my academic degrees.
And can you just tell me when you came to Toronto and just because your academic piece is a really important part of your story, right? So when did you first come to Toronto, and were you at U of T?
Yes, in '88 I came to Toronto for my MA in history in '88, and did Canadian Labour history at that time. And then while I was doing that, I took a course in Canadian medical history with Michael Bliss, and I thought, oh, I can do this. And I did a paper on psychosurgery and so on, and of course I actually knew a man who had a lobotomy when I was in St. Thomas, so it was something that I felt very strongly about. And then I thought, well, maybe I should do this history, because I think this is really what I want. I really enjoyed Canadian Labour history, which I did with Ian Radforth, but I wanted to do Canadian medical history, which was just opening up then. And of course, disability history I didn't ever even heard of it, but it didn't exist back 22 years ago. And at least not as far as I was concerned. Maybe it did some places, but not here in Toronto. So I switched in my PhD from Canadian Labour to Canadian Medical, although it has a Canadian Labour history component in it, obviously. So I decided I wanted to do work about, originally it was going to be history of lobotomy, but the records weren't accessible, so I decided to do about Queen Street patient lives. And that's when I became more public. I had been didn't tell anyone before then, outside of course people who already knew in my family, but I became decided to get more active, just to go to events, and so I started going to, actually the first one I went to outside of the book launch for Shrink Resistant in January '89, the really first time I went to an event would have been in November of 1990 at Ralph Thornton Centre with the Ontario Psychiatric Survivors Alliance, had a meeting there, and from then on I've been involved ever since. So that's where I met quite a few people whom I've known over the years since then. And so I became more involved, and I felt it obviously was important to connect my academic work with the community. I didn't want to be simply doing it cut off from the very people I'm writing about, based on not just my own personal experience, but the experience especially of people here in Toronto. So then I became active in different groups, the West End Psychiatric Survivors, and plenty of others besides. And so that led me to being involved in the Psych Survivor community through both political activism in the early days of being involved, and particularly through Psychiatric Survivor Project. That started in '93, although I was involved before then, and then of course continuing with my academic work throughout.
So, can you elaborate a little bit on that idea of being an academic and being a community activist?
Yes, sure. Yes, I feel that it's so important to well, first of all, being involved in uncovering the history of patients. I mean, there wasn't at U of T history department when I was there. I didn't find that there were many people I could really talk to about the work per se. There were some people I could, so there were some fellow students and obviously others who I could speak with, but I found the real people who knew the most about it were people who, of course, lived the experience, who were, not that there's nobody in the history department who hadn't lived the experience, but at least was public was living it, and that I was aware of, and that I knew. So I found it through people outside the university. In fact, I found my main source of support was in the community, so going out to different groups. And I also wanted, more importantly, to be involved because I had read Phoenix Rising from about the mid-'80s. I first saw it when I was in Windsor before I came to Toronto at an alternative bookstore. Oh, a magazine put out by psych patients. I was amazed, so I thought that was great. So, so I wanted to get more involved in finding out about the activism and the efforts to address issues around rights, because in the academy I often heard prejudiced comments made by students and professors that bothered me a lot. And so I thought, well, this isn't as liberal as often people perceive. So I decided I wanted to engage more with people who understood what it was about. And so that was important. And also feeling that the work was relevant to the wider community. And so, and just talking about it with people as well. So, and engaging other people with what they were doing in the community. And so it was a way of a mutual engagement of community work and finding out what people were doing and how we could work together and talk about both our past and present and link them together.
Yeah, but you know, so it was at York, right? The first time I heard you speak.
Oh, 99.
In the Senate chambers in '99.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I think I've mentioned it to you before that I'd read your work and I knew who you were, but I'd never seen you in person, right?
Right.
And that you were standing up at that conference. It was
The conference in memory, not in memory, he was still alive, he died last year.
Yeah.
But in honor of Charles Rowland's
Yes.
retirement, and it was about the medical historiography in Canada.
Yes, and I was doing my piece on region, right?
Mhm,
Yeah.
right.
So, and you got up and you said that you were a psych
Mhm.
survivor, and I was so,
Mhm.
you know, moved by that and
Mhm.
so blown away by your bravery, right?
Mhm.
And for me, it just, you know, it was quite a big, it was a memory, right?
Right.
And I guess I just still think that it was extremely brave of you to be out in the academic community, because there wasn't anyone else, right, in Canada. And I mean, I guess I'm just wondering if you wanted to, I mean, you have talked, but it's like you were out in some communities, but I guess if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that decision, because it's a really big decision to be out.
Yes,
in
very
a
much so.
out professionally, and in my mind, I could see that it was a risky thing to do, because it wasn't like you were a tenured
No.
prof with a job. You were probably still a graduate student at that point.
I was a postdoc.
You're a postdoc, right?
But I was public. I became, that's right. No, thanks for your memories of that event. Yes, became public at first with my doctoral dissertation supervisor when I asked him to take me on. It was in September of '89 with Michael Bliss. And as you said, it's a huge decision, and I grappled with it for a long time because I had never talked about it before, and for the reasons around prejudice and stigma and everything. So in fact, I denied, for example, I used to lie about certain years of my life, people ask me, and it's a long story, but I won't go into it, but I would actually make up stories about certain periods. And I really didn't like doing that. It felt really awful. And one student, actually, a fellow student, when I was a undergrad at University of Windsor, caught me in the lie. When, like students always do, we not sit out, we were actually standing in the hall outside the professor's office and waiting to go and see him in the line. And he asked me where I graduated from high school, and I said Assumption High School. And 1980, and his hair was red. He was Irish, red-haired fellow. Oh, so like yourself. And his face came almost enraged, and he said, I went to Assumption High School, I graduated in 1980, and I don't remember you. And then I quickly did my face turned about as red as his red hair, and I was very embarrassed, and he was absolutely right. He didn't remember me because I wasn't there. I had dropped out of school 4 years before. So anyway, I did a quick double back, and I said, oh, well, actually, I dropped out a little when I was 16, which was still a lie, because I'd actually dropped out when I was 14. I just didn't want, I just thought 16 was legal to do that, so he kind of backed off. And I said, and he was still my friend, but I never told him why I dropped out, and nor did I tell him that I dropped out even earlier than I did. But the point is, I always remembered that, and I didn't like that. So anyway, but when I eventually came to decide to do my PhD with Michael Bliss, I decided, when I asked him to be my supervisor, to tell him that I was, why I wanted to do this, and I did in September of '89, and his response to me, he was sitting there, and I said that I had been a psychiatric patient in my teens, and I'd been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and been in a hospital twice for a total of 6 months, for 2 different places, and an outpatient for years, etc. And he listened quietly, and he said, well, and I have to say, when he said that, Michael Bliss and I had many differences over the years. To put it mildly, we had very strong differences, but I have never forgotten that.
Well,
and I've always appreciated that it was the shrug that I will always appreciate, because I honestly thought he would have been, I didn't know how he would respond. In fact, I thought, in fact, I heard very prejudiced comments from lots of people in the university, so I didn't know. And he just simply said, so. And he said, I'm interested to see what you do with your work. And some years later, in one of the times when we were having difficulties, put it that way, I remember he actually recounted that conversation to me. He said, you did tell me because I had very strong critical views, which we had conflicts over, and he did say to me at one point, you did say to me when you asked me to be your supervisor that you had been a patient, and I appreciate that. I understand. So he actually remembered that too, and so I thought that was very important to me. But I still wasn't public with. It took me into 1990 to be public with more gradually with students, more, and then with other faculty. And in 1990, 91, 92, I became more public and certainly by 92, I was very public. By 1990, I was public with more people. Bliss was first person, because I felt I really felt I couldn't do this work without telling him, because I'd be constantly looking over my shoulder, and he would wonder, and I have my views, and anyway, so I'm always glad I did tell that, and I've always been, and I'll never forget his response, which was very huge relief to me, and whatever our many differences as time went on, that was very important that he did that. And so years later, when of course I was more public with other people, so as time went on, so I became more public with other people actually in the union. I was involved in Canadian Union of Educational Workers, and also with my fellow students and other people. So that was important to do that, and it was a huge thing to do, because 1989 was actually the year before I got involved in the psych survivor community. I was at that time not involved when I told Bliss, and it was really, I still kept it quiet. I started telling a few people. I did tell some of my peers, one person in particular, when in the first year I was in PhD program at the U of T, and then a few others gradually. But it was really from the fall of '90 on that because it's, and then eventually I said to myself, if people don't want to be my friend because I was a psych patient, then I don't want to be, then that's sort of people I want to have as friends. It took me a long time to come to that conclusion, because of course you're so insecure. Well, speaking for myself, I was very insecure and worried, and naturally people want friends and everything, but it took me a while to have the confidence to say that and especially because I was involved in the psych survivor community, with people from 90 on saying, you know, this is the sort of people I would rather be friends with who accept me as I am than people who decide they don't want to be friends with me because I've been in a psych facility. To me, it would be like not wanting to be friends with someone because you're gay or lesbian or the color of your skin or you're Jew, your red hair, exactly, or, but, you know, prejudice, the way you look, I mean, that's just, you know, so that's not the sort of people I want to be friends with. But it took a long time. I didn't come to that overnight, that's for sure. And so that was because of the example I saw of other people in the psych survivor community and what they were doing and the support networks they developed. And it wasn't like I just developed that on my own. There's no way I would have done that on my own. It was talking with other people, and also sometimes talking with people, and some people who were also not public nevertheless said, well, I was a patient too. You can think of that right away. So somebody, I remember talking about it in the early days when I was public in 90. So, and then meeting other people was very important. And also just realizing how little of our history was done. Virtually none of it was from our points of view. It was all from the doctor's points of view. And I got very frustrated. I often tell this when I give a spiel my talk somewhere, that one of the reasons that it inspired me was the people I knew, and I thought of them, and I then reading the history books where patients in asylums are just this big blob almost. In some of the, I'm talking about when I was reading books from the 80s and early 90s. It would be different now, I think, or so. And there was no relationships, no friendships. Patients were always acted upon, never in any way lived in a way that related to each other, very stereotypical and very derogatory references. And that really bothered me. And I thought, one person in particular who inspired me, her name was Barbara, and when I was in St. Thomas when I was 16, and I got to know her well. She was a young woman. I was 16, she was 19, and she was labeled retarded, and she had an intellectual disability, but I got to know her very well, and we became friends, and I remember saying, and I had prejudices towards people labeled retarded up to that point, and then I thought to myself, she's retarded? Well, what does that make so many others of us? She's more humanity than most people I know. What does these labels mean? So that she, just by her example and by her being a wonderful human being, just taught me more than all the books. And so I thought of her often when I read, you know, and we were very good friends, and the friends she had with other people, and other patients who were friends also with myself and others. And, you know, and I thought, well, there's more to this history than what you're seeing in the book, where the patients don't have any friends, or people, in this case, people with different types of disabilities, because she was actually not a psychiatric label diagnosis. She was had a developmental disability, and there were people with developmental disabilities, as we could now use the term, who were there when I was there in St. Thomas. So quite a few actually. So so then it challenged my views too, and then but also to think about how we can think of it. And I said, well, in my just very brief, I was there for 6 months. It was long for me, but compared to most people, it was quite short, including people whom I knew who'd been in some cases for years in hospitals and different places. And I'd been at Regional Children's Center in Windsor a few years before that. But and then I said, you know, all of these people, there must be how many other stories long before all of us came around, how many other friends they had made. So I just decided to go and do something about it. And that's where I led to what the work I did. Originally, like I say, I wanted to focus on lobotomy. I had done research because there was a man who was, eventually I was transferred to another ward for most, I was on the admitting ward, and then eventually sent to the young adult unit ward. And it was right next to geriatric ward, and it was right, you had the patients from the geriatric ward had to walk through our ward to get through to the other. And one of the men who took the dishes out to get washed 3 times a day, he had a lobotomy, and I got to know him a little bit, and I never forgot him. I never knew his name, I'm sorry to say, Um, and but anyways, I've often thought of them, and so I really wanted to talk about their experiences, but I couldn't get the records. Their hospitals aren't too thrilled to release those records. So I ended up focusing on what I did, which was patient life at Queen Street.
And were you the first, like when I did my master's, you know, I was the first person to get access to the patient case file at Riverview, and then Mary Ellen did a similar study. But were you the first person in Ontario to be looking at patient case files as a historian?
No, Wendy Mitchinson used
Oh, Wendy
them.
had used them. Okay.
No,
okay.
she used them in her work. S.E.D. Short used them.
Okay.
But they didn't use it like from the patient's perspective.
Yeah.
You know? But Wendy did include some perspectives in her book on the nature of their bodies. So she does have some perspective, but that's not the focus of her own.
Yeah.
But she does include some. S.E.D. Short had a few, but he's very, frankly, disparaging as far as I was concerned. I was very disappointed with his book on the Buck, where his focus was on Richard Murray's Buck at London Asylum.
Yeah, but I still, anyways, I still remember that some of his stuff about institutional culture was useful.
Yes, I suppose, but the way he portrayed the patients, I thought was very...
I would have to reread. I mean, it's a long time, right, since I did my master's, right?
Yeah, I found, especially when he used the ratings, he was very disparaging. That really upset me. In fact, I criticized him in an article, the one actually that came out of the conference. But yeah, there were a few people who have been, and Tom Brown, and his, but his was mainly using annual reports. But he used some patient records, but from the patient's point of view, focus exclusively, I suppose you could say that mine was. But there are other people who used it in other ways too before me.
So, I just want to. Oh, we're doing fine for time, but. So I think the next thing that I wanted to ask you about was about teaching Mad People's History.
Oh, yeah.
And starting, because I actually think that happened when you were a graduate student, right?
Well, yes, I originally taught, I originally had, I was involved in a group called the Marxist Institute, and I taught a course called Madness, Medicine, and Mythology. And I taught it a couple of times. First time was in '92. It was summer of '92. In fact, that's where I met Lilith for the first time. She saw a poster, and so we've been friends ever since. And it was at that summer of '92, and then in the winter of '93, it was at that school that you go right around Spadina Crescent.
Okay.
Lord Lansdowne.
Lord Lansdowne, yes.
Lord Lansdowne School.
Yeah.
And because they got some deal somehow, we were able to get a class there. But so I taught that, and I had the idea of doing something, teaching it that was of course non-credit. That was just anybody could. It was a free community. Although I think they asked people to donate $5 or $10 and something that they could, if they could, and we just sat in for free. But anyway, so later when I finished. I defended my dissertation in early '97. I finished it in late '96 and defended in early '97, then doing different things. And I got the postdoc, the Hannah postdoc, in '98, which was 2 years. In the second year of that, you were given $5,000 if you wanted it, which I did, and to teach any course you want, either one that exists or to create one yourself. And I said, wow, and that was the time to revive that old course I had that I originally taught for the Marxist Institute 8 years earlier for the first time. So I taught it, and Janis Langens, who was the director, he was very supportive. He was surprised. I still remember going to meet him to tell him what I would like to teach, and I called it Mad People's History. Mad People's History. He said, wow. And he was definitely surprised, but he was fully supportive. So I really appreciate that. That was at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology
at U of T.
At U of T for my postdoc. Pauline Majumdar was my supervisor. She was wonderful to work with there. So they were very supportive, and I taught it, but because it was external funding, and it was very successful. I had students wanting to know when I would be teaching it again, who couldn't take it the first time. So I taught it in once a week from May to August of 2000, spread it out over the whole summer. And yeah, I had a great time. I was very nervous when teaching it, but because I really wanted to do a good job. And I was naturally the first time, it was the first time I'd ever taught a course on my own, ever. Not just, I mean, other than being a TA, I'd never taught a course ever, so this is really big. So, but it went very well, and of course there were things I definitely wanted to improve, which I did as time went on, but still I was, you know, but the U of T wouldn't fund it. They said that, in fact, I went over, I probably should say where, but IHPST couldn't fund it because they don't have the budget for that, and they were completely supportive. It was on the books because it has to go through this whole approval process, like any course. It was actually, actually the box down there, HPS 317 is still there. I've used it for other stuff since then. But it was approved the previous year, in '89, for that the following year. And my postdoc ended at the end of August of 2000. And I went to talk to, I was told where to go to discuss it with a guy, administrator.
Oh.
Oops, Domenica. I'm in a meeting, Domenica.
Turn me down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's, you said you went over to talk to an administrator.
Yes, so as I was saying, after my postdoc ended and I was asked around about who I could see to get it going again, and I went to an administrator at the U of T who was supportive verbally, but he was very frustrated. He said, I don't have money to give out. And he pointed over to Simcoe Hall, which is the administration's office, which is where the president sits and where all the top administrators are at U of T. And he said, those dinosaurs over there, they won't give me the funding I need. And I always remember, he was actually sympathetic. He thought this was a good course, and you could see that people were interested, but they didn't have any fun. The U of T, $5,000 would, at that time, I don't know what it was now, but that's, yeah. So, I mean, so they didn't fund it, and it was, of course, very disappointing. So anyway, so I just continued doing other, I was unemployed for a while, but eventually I got the job with Linters, and in the doing the Linters, but in the meantime, I talked with, as my postdoc was winding down, Judith Sandys, actually just at the very end of my first time I taught it at U of T, Judith Sandys from Ryerson suggested, why don't you try to see if you can bring it to a school of disabilities. I said, oh yeah, great. So they were just getting started up. They started in '99, and so in 2001 I met with Melanie Panich, who's director of School of Disability Studies, and totally supportive as well of getting taught there. So I taught it at Ryerson beginning 2002, and again I taught it twice in 2003. So I taught it, yeah, I taught it in summer 2002, and again in the winter of 2003, and in the fall of 2003. And I was slated to teach again, but got hired here. So I brought it here. So that's how it started. So basically what happened is I started at U of T. They were supportive with the external funding, but there was no external funding after my postdoc ended. So I was invited to Ryerson School of Disability Studies to teach it there. And now I'm glad to say David Revel has had great success in teaching it there in class and online now. He has it online as well. And now I teach it here, of course, as well at U of T, not quite, Freudian slip, at York, in the Critical Disability Studies program.
So how unique is, I can't think of anywhere else that has Mad People's History. I'm wondering, do any history departments have a Mad People's History course, or do you think there's more space for it in disability studies?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. I think that it's interesting. Disability studies is the one that really grabbed this. I've noticed that as well. It was originally supported by the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, U of T, but it was the disability studies has really sustained it, and so that at Ryerson and then here at York, and I think that's very important. And I would hope that history would get more interested, and I also need to have the people to teach it as well, which is important. I think Bob Menzies is teaching something to the equivalent. I'm not sure what the title is, but he teaches something at Simon Fraser University. He's a sociologist with historical background, of course, in his work. So I think he teaches something along, it's not called Mad People's History, I don't know the name of it, but something along the lines of that. And I know there's other courses taught elsewhere. I think McMaster David Wright teaches a course on history of mental illness, it's called, or something along those lines, and there's a few other places. But
James Moran must teach something.
Yeah, James
similar
probably does.
At UP. But the Mad People's History is a specific
Yes,
focus,
exactly.
right? Like I wouldn't, it would be interesting, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I don't know what Bob teaches, but his focus would be a bit different than yours, I think.
Yes, well, the whole point of wanting to teach, I mean, all the courses I mentioned other than David's, I think would be different in focus, although I should be careful to say that because I haven't looked at their syllabi.
Well, I don't know, we've talked about Michael Bliss, we can move on.
Yes, but I guess it's one way of, the way I focused it is to talk about the history of the people.
Yeah.
I deliberately called it Mad People's History because originally it was called Mad People's Own History at U of T, and that was because the person I was working with, who was administratively inserted that name in it. I didn't really like the word own. Inserted the word own in it. I called it, and when I took it to Ryerson, I took the word own out. It just didn't jar well. Mad People's Own History. It had the same theme, but anyway, I took the word out when I went to Ryerson because I wanted it. My original title was Mad People's History, and for some reason she thought the word own would be better in it, which I never quite figured out, but I didn't have the confidence to tell her no, and she was the one making the decision, so, and she was supportive, I have to say, and it did happen, so that's the most important thing. But when I took it elsewhere, I made sure to just call it Mad People's History, and to Ryerson here. And the main point is to have the focus on the people who lived these experiences, rather than a history of ideas, which is very important, but there are courses out there that talk about that. I want to talk about from the points of view of people who lived these experiences and say that we have this history, just like women's history in different ways that's taught. Aboriginal history, working class history, gay and lesbian history, African Canadian history, and so on. There was all kinds of different groups which over the last 30 years have fought to get their perspectives included in academia. And I didn't mention any of this before, but that's also been an important inspiration to the work I'm doing. I didn't do it just out of thin air. I also saw, well, labor history, look at all the important work done there, and women's history, and so on. So so I said, this is another way of doing the history too, and it incorporates all those aspects into it. But the main point is to do it from the point of view of the people who lived these experiences, rather than just focusing on the ideas, which is important, and I do talk about ideas in the course, but I always make sure the focus is on the people who lived the experiences as people who are considered mad. And that's why I use the word mad in the title, because it's the longest one, the oldest one in terms of the history of our history. History of mental illness, for example, is a term that's only been used the last 100, 120 years or so, more commonly. So it's mad, whereas mad goes back to ancient Babylon in the book of Daniel, about the Nebuchadnezzar and others. You read about people's experience of madness, so it's a lot longer history. I also don't want to use a biodeterministic term either, because of course I think mad encompasses a much broader. It can include that people choose to believe of biodeterminism, that can be encompassed in it, but there are plenty who choose not to believe, so I want to, or who are somewhere in the middle, and so I want to encompass a much broader perspective than one perspective under a biological model. Having said that, there are people who still don't like the title Mad People's History. I know I've talked to them, including psych survivors. Well, psych consumers, some survivors. I don't like the term. Why do you call it Mad People's History? My argument is, as I said, to emphasize the people who lived it and also the long history of it, and to emphasize, to try to reclaim that there is also madness is not always badness, which is important, and that's been a problem, I think, in our history, where mad is automatically created with violence, and negation of human experience rather than experiences that have contributed in many ways through great anguish. I don't think we should romanticize madness at all, and on the contrary, because of all the despair and oppression and anguish people go through, but at the same time we also have to acknowledge the contributions in a way that acknowledges that people who are mad shouldn't be considered automatically bad, and their experiences considered to be automatically bad. There's a history of good madness as well, of people contributing in different ways in ancient and medieval times, which has kind of fallen out by the wayside in modern times. So I think it's important to reclaim that history.
And sometimes just to accept that that's how people are too, that's
Yes,
part of who they are, right?
Exactly.
So I went to ask you a bit more about teaching mad people's history, because I reread your piece last night, so it's fresh in my head. But I wanted to ask a specific question about the Marxist Institute, because who was in your first classes for it? I'm just wondering who attended.
Well, I remember a number. So there were some people, psych survivors, who attended. Lilith came after we posted it around different places. We put it up in Kensington Market and on college, and Spadina and Bloor and all that. We would go and put it on the poles. You know how you get the water with the dried milk, and that would make, and you go as a paintbrush and put it on the poles. And then it was advertised in Now magazine, and they had that weekly free column where you put things. So there were people who were, there was I can remember a couple of, one person I remember was a mental health professional, and in fact she was a social worker. And I remember her, and I saw her off and on at different times over the years. I haven't seen her in probably 10 years. But I remember she attended, and her partner attended. There were several people whom I didn't really know their background very well, and I didn't ask them, because of course it's none of my business I can't go and ask. But there was a couple of psych survivors who attended, self-identified psych survivors who attended. And the first course, if I remember correctly, was 6 weeks long, and 6 classes long. And then the second one was 8 classes, so I expanded it. And some I had guest speakers. Don King gave a guest talk, for example, and so we had different people coming from different backgrounds, so it was just people who had heard of it through some of the social service agencies and through Now magazine, but. It was a small group. I would maybe 7 or 8 people, but it was good actually. Good discussions in the first one. Yeah.
So in your article about teaching mad people's history, you talk about the important, I mean, in a sense of modeling within the academy, right, and fighting discrimination from within, modeling as a person who's been part of the mental health system, and I just wondered if you wanted to expand on, because it's a very political, it's not political just in terms of content, in a sense of what you're teaching, but it's also political in terms of that somebody who's out as a psych survivor and working within, doing something very with a political message within the academy, which can be, I don't know, can sort of, what's the word? Sorry.
Cause friction?
No, I think that the academy's really good sometimes at dulling the edge of.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, okay,
yeah.
yes, co-opting. And yes, that's, I mean, that's true. I mean, how to keep it in a way that's socially relevant for people who've lived
Sure,
it.
yeah.
Well, part of it is listening to the criticisms of people who've taken it or who haven't but have thought of taking it. I mean, I've been, when I was both at U of T and Ryerson. Now here I was been left free to do what I want with the course. So nobody's ever tried to interfere and tell me at any of the places where I did teach it what I can do. But I think to keeping it relevant, it's been very much just, part of it is the fact that using so much personal accounts, first-person accounts, has made it much more important to people as well in that sense, and so has not dulled it, if you will, or made it co-opted to the extent that it would look like it would be just a average course you could have in a psychiatric faculty, for example. Although it'd be great, I'd actually be very glad to teach a course like this in a psychiatric faculty engaged. That's exactly who I'd like to engage among many others, because if you want to, I want to talk to people who've lived the experience, but you also want to talk to people to help to challenge people's views. I think that's important. So, so I think that's helped a lot, and always never forgetting why it is I'm doing this too, and the obligation I have to those who've come before me. I mean, I'm extraordinarily privileged to teach in this course and being in this position, and even having done the work I've done, I know I'm not representative of psych survivors at all, being well, first of all, a white male professor. Most psych survivors are people who don't have much money. It's like consumer survivors, people who are, say, clients, whatever term they wish to use. They don't have a lot of money in most cases. Then a lot of people, most don't have any sort of social privilege that a professor has because of our position as professors, or even before my position as a PhD student, let alone as a professor. So I've always said, well, I've got this elite position, and it is an elite position in our society. Well, I'm going to do it, I'm going to take it and run with it, and do what I want, what I would like to do. So many people in these elite positions have used the position of the academy against people with disabilities, or consumer survivors, or psychiatric patients. I think it's time to turn the tables a little bit, at least in my little corner of the academy. And so that's what I want very much to do, and so I think that keeps me keep making sure it's relevant and always staying engaged with the community. Sometimes it's very frustrating. I'm way up here at York, and I also live up here, so going downtown, it's it takes a lot of time, and so I always want to make sure I'm engaged, not cut off, and not in an ivory tower, so to speak. But having said that, there are also a lot of people with psych history right here on campus. So I always say to people, well, you're in the ivory tower. Well, yes, it's certainly, in one sense, just being in this office and everything, a very privileged position. But at the same time, there are lots of people with real life challenges right here at York University, as there is at all parts of the community in any education or other community facility. So that's important too, to always remember the obligation we have to those whose career, frankly, I've based my work on, and that's very important.
So, I want you to talk about PSAT.
Okay. The Psychiatric Survivor Archives, yes, we've founded in 2001. Now, Psychiatric Survivor Archives of Toronto's. We had talks in the 90s to do something. Now, Mal Starkman, really, it was his idea long before I came to it. He had the idea of creating Mal Starkman's our archivist, and you've already interviewed Mal. So he had the idea back in the 80s to create a MAD archives, in the early 80s. And, but he was unable to do so, partly because he was in Queen Street, as he's public about talking about. So eventually in the mid-90s, some of us meaning Don and myself, and eventually Mel later in the 90s, talking about it. But from about 99 to 2000, early 2001, we really talked about it a lot. And finally, to make a long story short, we founded the PSAT. Our first meeting was Don White's, Mel Starkman, Janet Brooke, and myself at the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center in January of 2001. And the idea is to have archives to preserve our own history, because we know so much of it is going to be lost otherwise. And so it's very important to get a place. And to make a long story short, we eventually did get some free space at Sound Times with Lana Fredo, beginning in '04, and at Gerstein Center from '04 and 2004 as well. Most of our material is housed in the basement storage room we have that's specially just for us, this locked storage room, and a wonderful amount of material there. We've been trying to find a place for a reading room. It's not accessible, unfortunately, and we almost had a place last month, and we were negotiating a lease, and he said the owners have just sold the building. I have to find out what the new owners think. So we're in limbo right now. We're back to square one, unfortunately. We were thrilled with the location, Bloor and Spadina. Everything was working out. It was too good to be true, we thought, and it was. At least it is now. Let's hope I'll be able to eat these words in a few weeks if he gets back to me and says the new owners will allow us to go in there, but we have no idea. So we're still actively looking for a place, because we get requests all the time to look at this material. We've had documents donated from across Canada and the US, mainly from Ontario, but we have had people elsewhere send documents in other parts of Canada, but also an enormous amount of material sent by a man in New York City, Alan Markman, 11 bankers' boxes of material, documentary evidence, and primary source material primarily, and then from David Oakes at Mind Freedom in Oregon donated a bunch of stuff as well. So we have a good amount, and then of course people like Don Waits and others, and Empowerment Council have donated, Queen Street Patient Council donated a bunch of material. So we've got a lot of material. Lots of books can be written on them, and projects can be used to. We just want to trying to get it to find a place. So that's important. We've also been involved in public activities like preserving the wall at Queen Street.
It was on my list.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
for you to talk about the wall.
Okay, yes, the patient-built wall in the east, west, and south side, with the south side built in 1860 and the east and west sides were rebuilt in 1888-89. The boundary wall there, which is all that's left besides two small shops at the very back of the grounds of what is now CAMH, Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And these are from the old 19th century asylum. And we have been fighting to, we were very engaged to fight to preserve the wall, especially the east wall, which was in danger of being torn down in the early 2000s. That battle was won by 2004, which was wonderful, and CAMH agreed to preserve the wall. Of the 100% that was left, they agreed to preserve 96% of it, and that's all been, there was a small section at the north east corner of the wall that they took down for the Adelaide extension, which I wished hadn't happened because it was actually a very beautiful part of the wall. But nevertheless, the important thing is the vast majority of the wall is being preserved, and those bricks that were taken from that one small section are used in other parts of the wall for restoration purposes.
So,
and then, oh sorry, I was just going to say,
yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just going to say, we're also doing a Plaque Project, which is really going very well, and we're having a series of 9 plaques, which CAMH has agreed to. We wrote up the text, and that will be installed, we're hoping, this summer on the 150th anniversary of the South Wall. And we're having a fundraising event, actually, for it on April 21. I sent the email to you about the wall, the April 21, I think, Guidestone, Words on the Wall, it's called.
okay.
And the response has been phenomenal. Andrea, who was coordinating, Andrea White's idea with her partner Chris Reed, it's a silent auction to raise money for the wall plaques, because we've raised about 5,000 now, and we still need another about 3,000. And so, but there was over 50 bricks have been requested for. CAMH has provided us with bricks from the parts of the building they're tearing down now, that people can make into artistic statements about the wall, and then we're going to auction them off on April 21st at a silent auction at the Gladstone. And it's been a phenomenal response. All kinds of people have been. So I give that's been Andrea White's idea, and her partner Chris Reed. They've done a great job at coordinating it. And the bricks are actually now, I got the email from Lucy this morning, they're now sitting in her office for people to come down and pick up, because Lucy's coordinating and having the bricks in her office. So it's very exciting, lots going on.
So I just want to, I know why the wall's really important, but just to put it on tape, the why is the wall important? What does it represent?
Yes, the wall is important because it was built by unpaid patient laborers in the 1860 portion and the 1889 portion, 88, 89. It was built by patient laborers who weren't paid any money, and the history of their having built it wasn't even acknowledged as recently as a City of Toronto report in 1996, which was the same year I found the information available in publicly available documents at the Archives of Ontario. And I thought needs to be told. So since the mid to late 90s, we've been telling what we, meaning people in the Psych Survivor Committee, Ruth and Friendly Spike, had a play about it, Patient Life at the Queen Street, and involved sex consumer survivors, and centered around the wall, and then the efforts to preserve it. So it's very important that we talk about what the wall represents in terms of the history of exploitation and exclusion, because it has a very grim history, but using it to liberate the stories. Because there are a lot of people in our community who wanted to tear the wall down. That was, oh yes, that was very common when we were trying to, in the early days of our trying to preserve the wall. I've had people who told me very bluntly, who were psych survivors and consumers, told me that the wall should be torn down. It was a represented stigma, which it does. It represents exclusion, no question about it. But my argument has always been that by tearing it down, we tear down the memory of the people the last vestiges of the memory of the people who built it and who worked and lived and died behind it. By pointing to this wall, we can use it to remember them, to make it as a permanent public memorial, and also about their abilities, and to fight the prejudices around people not getting paid for their work. Look at this wall. I always tell people when I give the wall tours, it's the wall at Queen and Straw is now over 120 years old. You're trying to tell me psych patients can't do good work? Come and look at this wall. Or the wall in the south section is 150 years old. Built the year Abraham Lincoln was elected president, 7 years before the Confederation of Canada. So try to tell me that patients can't do good work, and come look at these structures. And so it's a way of also fighting the prejudice today by saying, here's a tangible symbol of what people with a psych history can do and who deserve to be paid for their work today, and unlike the past. So that's why it's so essential to help it to liberate these stories from the past and challenge the prejudices that are ongoing today.
Mm-hmm. That was great. So the play and the wall, that came out of your research, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it came out of my dissertation research for my PhD, which I did, as I mentioned, at U of T in the history department with Professor Bliss and Michael Bliss and Pauline Majumdar, and a number of others were also on the committee at the end. Ian Radford was on the committee, and Carolyn Strange and Sylvia Van Kirk, and among others they were on the external, or on the final committee at the end. Michael Bliss and Pauline Majumdar were on it throughout the whole time. Yeah, so it was from my PhD dissertation, and I first gave a public talk about it in '94 at Parkdale Library, actually, at a Psychiatric Survivor event, Psychiatric Survivor Festival. And so trying to get the history more, and actually that's where I first used the title Remembrance of Patients Past in a paper reading some of the letters that patients wrote in the history files, and I gave it at a talk then. But I also think it's so important to get the word out there about what this history is. So I wanted to make sure it was not just sitting on a shelf. And I've been extraordinarily fortunate. I mean, I know nothing about plays, how to put on a play. And it was thanks to Ruth Stackhouse, a Friendly Spike Theatre band, and Ken Innes. I wrote the play, and then Ken dramaturged it, because I'm obviously not a playwright. They put it on, and it ran for a different one. The first time was the spring of '98, and then the spring of '99, and the spring of 2000. In fact, the book launch was actually the 10th anniversary. That would be next month. We had it, just right near Queen Street. It was also done at Queen Street in the mall once. And, so yeah, thanks to the people I got to know, I could never have done that by myself. I know nothing about any of that sort of thing, about putting on theater performances. So it was a great learning opportunity too, to see how that could be done. And then just working with other comrades and friends in the psych survivor community on PSAT projects and other things, and allies as well. So that's been very important.
And the that exhibition down at St. Lawrence
Oh,
Market,
yes,
that's
right.
another
Mhm.
academic community connection
Precisely.
that you've
Mhm.
made. What was your role in that?
That was, yeah, the John Court was very supportive and helpful in that. In fact, John Court, who's the archivist at CAMH, today Center for Addiction and Mental Health, contacted me in late 2003 about, or actually it was maybe this, actually it was a bit earlier, it was summer of 2003, about the potential of doing a exhibit at the Market Gallery at downtown on Front Street, a city-run gallery, about the history it was the architectural history and social history of the Toronto and Lakeshore asylums. And they were doing it in CAMH Archives, for instance, the archives were doing it in collaboration with the Toronto Region Architectural Conservancy, and they wanted to know if PSAT would like to be involved. And so, of course, I said, yeah, great. And so we had a display of patient activist history in that display, which we worked with. So it was a collaboration between John Court, CAMH Archives, Toronto Region Architectural Conservancy, and the Psychiatric Survivor Archives of Toronto, and Mel was very much involved. His story was talked about there. It was, Phoenix Rising and other documents. And we also got the Archives of Ontario was helpful in getting some original letters displayed as well that had been written by patients, but that were in my book. So that was, so yeah, that was great to see that. And then a couple of years ago, actually, now that you mentioned about the Market Gallery, Ryerson University did a history display at Royal Ontario Museum called Out From Under, and it was on there for about 3 months. And Ruth Stackhouse, who directed and whose idea it was to have the play from '98 to 2000. As part of the exhibit, did on patient labor, and she took stuff from research I had done, and then put it on panels about 3 women in particular, Audrey, Matilda, and Alice, Audrey, Matilda, and I think Audrey, Matilda, and May, and they told their stories using information from research. So that was wonderful to see. That was Ryerson's idea. I'm not taking any credit for doing that at the RON. That was their project, and it was Ruth who put it on based on the research. So it's very exciting to see it get out in different ways like that.
And you've also been involved with the cemetery cleanup at Mimco.
Right, that's right. The Lakeshore, former Mimico Asylum and the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. The main impetus for that has been Ed Januszewski. Ed has been, in fact, I first met Ed, now that I think of it, at the Market Gallery exhibit. He was helping with that when we were doing that, which was on from March to June of 2004. But yeah, Ed is a retired social worker who worked at Lakeshore and then later at Queen Street, and he's been a wonderful ally. He's done great work, and he's been the person who's really spearheaded the preservation and restoration of that cemetery, where 1,537 people have been buried, of whom all but 154 are in unmarked graves. And so PSAT has been involved in the early years especially, and going out and helping to uncover the markings. And since 2004-05, in fact 2005 we had a whole remembrance day there and uncovered about 75 to 80 of the markers that had been covered up by dirt and grass. And every year there is an event to actually twice a year, usually spring and fall, to clean up the cemetery that Ed organizes. So that's been very important too. And so Ed is really the main person who's the person behind doing all most of the work, and he was tracked down, who is buried there, and has helped people find their relatives. He's done a great job on that, and PSAT has been very supportive and engaged and involved in that. But it's great to see other people doing this work too, because that's, PSAT only has so many time and resources, so we help to support the early years, and then it kind of branched off into Lakeshore Asylum Cemetery Project, which is great. That's what this work should be. The more people are involved, the better.
So that is like on my little list here.
Okay, very good.
But I wondered if you could just finish off, and you may have other things that I haven't covered that you think we should talk about, but if you could finish off with just a statement about the psych survivor movement, and why is it important? Why was it an important moment for you when you encountered the psych survivor movement coming to Toronto as a university student?
Okay, yes, it's very important, and of course I didn't really talk about terminology much, but of course psych survivor is usually people who are more critical of the medical model, but there are plenty of people who are also somewhere in between, and then there are people who are anti-psychiatry. I'm one of the people who's in between. I recognize that people I definitely know people who would be dead if they didn't have somewhere to go in mental health. For mental health support, mental health professionals being supportive. So I think that's important to emphasize, but I also know there's lots that needs to be changed, and so I'm very sympathetic and supportive of the critical perspective. And so I was very attracted as a university student to find out what was going on in the psych. I saw Phoenix Rising, and then what was going on in the psych survivor community. What is this all about? And even the term psych survivor was an interesting concept, which I'd always described myself as an ex-psych patient by that time. I didn't use the word survivor until the early 90s. I always identified as an ex-patient, and I still use the word patient often. Many of my friends will never forgive me for that, but I have to admit, I think the word patient is how I feel comfortable identifying an ex-patient, and it doesn't bother me quite, whereas it does many other people I know, and I respect that, but we all have our different points of view on it, because I saw myself then as a patient. But in terms of coming to Toronto, when I came here, I thought, wow, and I have to say the first year I wasn't involved at all. I came in '88, and the first year in my MA year, I actually wasn't involved in anything. I did go to the book launch. There were book, I don't know whether it was probably a book launch. It was a book reading at it's gone now, but it was right at Bloor and St. George. Which one was me? I can't remember the name, but anyways, I'll remember the Student Christian Movement.
Yeah.
That's it, SCN. Yeah. They had a book launch, and Don Whites and Bonnie Burstow read from Shrink Resistant in January '89, but I didn't get to know them then. I didn't get to know Don, for example, for about 3 more years. I didn't really get to know him until '92, but I started getting involved in '90s because it just felt that, as I said, I wanted to just to get more involved in the community, people I thought would not be judgmental, first of all, and also politically I very much support what they are doing around civil rights, and I was very inspired by seeing what the work that many people had been doing, challenging the discrimination that had been going on and being public, as that really impressed me. And so I started going, hesitantly to meetings, and then I wasn't hesitant after a short while, and thought this is important. And I mean, we certainly have our differences. I can think of meetings that where people, had lots of arguments, and that happens to any group. But the main thing is I found that the contacts and the support that people gave one another. So for me as a student, and having heard so many prejudiced comments by people whom I thought would have known better, who were in the academy, and I can think of some professors and teachers that I'd heard over the years who made bigoted comments, whom I had really respected, and it really bothered me. And anyway, so I decided to go, as well as, let alone amongst other people more generally, to go and meet with other people who have a similar experience. So, and then it was essential form of support and political activism in terms of finding where to go and direction to take in my own work and in my own life. So, so that's important.
You know, I have one more question. I do have one more question. This is a real academic question, but in terms of your publications, which a publication or publications are that you're particularly proud of, like that you feel were a really meaningful piece of work that you produced?
Remembrance of Patients Past, my PhD dissertation.
And your book.
Yes, that's right. My book, Remembrance of Patients Past. It was, for me, the most important because I felt so obligated to the people I wrote about, and it meant so much to me. It also meant a lot that I could dedicate it to my mother and father, who I haven't mentioned them, but without them I wouldn't be here today. They were very supportive, to put it mildly. So I don't have any doubt that without their support I would never have been here. So it was very important for me to be able to dedicate my book to them. And actually it was launched on my mom's 70th birthday, which was really touching. And so it means a great deal to me. And also to talk about the people whom I wrote about, so important. When I often tell the story of how, and I wonder if it's not that uncommon to me, but I finished my PhD dissertation, all the revisions, everything, to hand into my committee on a Friday. And I got it all printed, and I was going to go and bring it into the history, and I did go and bring it into the, well actually there was two different places, one in the history department, one at the history of medicine office, on the Monday. And on that weekend, I was literally paranoid that something would happen to my dissertation. And in fact, I went to visit a friend actually at what was then called Windsor Mental Health Center. He was a patient there. I was afraid my apartment would burn down, my dissertation. And then I brought it in. Finally, I gave it to in the history department, and for Professor Blisson, and I had to give one to Shorter as well, who was on my committee then, and then Majumdar. And after I left it for all of them, I said on that Monday, I said, "Oh, now I can die." Honestly, I said that to myself. I said, my dissertation is now there, my obligation to the people, at least I know if I died now, and my house burned down, or my apartment burned down, I should say, that the writings of the people I wrote about will be there, and that their memory is somehow preserved. So I felt, and then of course, then I kept saying, oh, I have to get this published. So now that it's published, so it meant so much to me that people who had been, I mean, I think to myself, well, whatever difficulties I've had in my life, I read the stories of people who were just totally ignored for decade after decade. I'm going to be 48 this year, and I think some of the people there would have been in Queen Street for another 35 years. Some of them died in their late 70s and into their 80s. Winston O died when he was almost 90. He would have been there for another 40, because he was admitted he was there for 57 years. I mean, there are people there for decades. Nobody paid any attention to. So I think, the immense obligation I feel to them, and to tell their stories and to get it out there. And so that's why I think that's without any doubt in my mind the publication I'm most proud of. Mm-hmm. And that is, somebody said this to me, I can't remember who was, somebody said, your book has had so many lives, the Remembrance of Patients Past, because, in the play and in different ways and different, in the wall tours and the ROM and then the market gallery. So it's true. I think, well, the important thing is I've been very fortunate to get the stories out there in so many different ways and through so many people's support. So that's important. So that's it means the most to me out of anything I've done, mm-hmm. and probably always will.
It's that reclaiming their stories from the documents,
exactly,
right?
Exactly,
yeah.
Bringing their past to life, and so moving. When I would read their stories, I would have the file, and some of them, not many, but some had the pictures. And I would, when I would be in the archives, here would be the document, I'd be going through it, but I'd always make sure the picture of the person I was doing the research on was right there in front of me. And never forget, these were real people.
At Riverview, they always had, the Essendale files always had the photograph, and you could look at them and just, I don't know, some of the photographs I still remember, and the
Yes.
hand-knit sweater. Or,
Right, exactly. Yeah,
You know?
yeah. One of the pictures I have of a woman in Esther. Yeah, hand-knit sweater. She has. A little
Did you give them pseudonyms?
You had to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
in Ontario. You have to give, unless they've died 100 years or less before.
Mhm.
You have to give them pseudonyms. So Audrey B, her real initials R.A.B., but her actual name is not Audrey. I had to change that. I know their names, but you're not supposed
Yeah.
to. It's against the law for protection of privacy issues, and you can't give any identifying information
Mhm.
where they lived or anything like that. So,
Yeah.
so very good.
Well, we're supposed to finish at 3, so it's just
Yeah.
after 3.
Yes, very good.
But I do want, unless
Oh,
you're
I'm-
allergic to chocolate.
Oh, well, I'll take one.
So,
Sure,
but they're
I'll
all
take
different
that.
kinds of flavors.
Oh,
Like, so it depends on which.
Oh, okay. I'll
What,
Oh, I
think
like
that-
this one. That's
Okay, the
I'm
mint?
a
Okay,
mint person.
that's good.